Welcome in. Let's have a story. This is part of a series of videos where I'm reading To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. In the description, you'll find a link to a playlist of all the videos, along with timestamps if you want to skip ahead. If you aren't familiar with Virginia Woolf, know that her writing style is a little unusual. She doesn't use traditional narration or dialogue, but instead puts you inside the minds of the characters and lets you listen in on their stream of consciousness. So it jumps around in strange ways, just like a person's thoughts jump around. The book To the Lighthouse is in 3 parts, each with several chapters. The first part is called The Window. Let's begin. Chapter 12. She folded the green shawl about her shoulders. She took his arm. His beauty was so great, she said, beginning to speak of Kennedy the gardener. At once he was so awfully handsome that she couldn't dismiss him. There was a ladder against the greenhouse, and little lumps of putty stuck about, for they were beginning to mend the greenhouse. Yes, but as she strolled along with her husband, she felt that that particular source of worry had been placed. She had it on the tip of her tongue to say as they strolled, "It'll cost £50. But instead, for her heart failed her about money, she talked about Jasper shooting birds, and he said at once, soothing her instantly, that it was natural in a boy, and he trusted he would find better ways of amusing himself before long. Her husband was so sensible, so just, and so she said, yes, all children go through stages, and began considering the dahlias in the big bed and wondering about next year's flowers. And had he heard the children's nickname for Charles Tansley, she asked. The atheist, they called him, the little atheist. He's not a polished specimen, said Mr. Ramsay. Far from it, said Mrs. Ramsay. She supposed it was all right, leaving him to his own devices, Mrs. Ramsay said, wondering whether it was any use sending down bulbs. Did they plant them? Oh, he has his dissertation to write, said Mr. Ramsay. She knew all about that, said Mrs. Ramsay. He talked of nothing else. It was about the influence of somebody upon something. Well, it's all he has to count on, said Mr. Ramsay. Pray heaven he won't fall in love with Prue, said Mrs. Ramsay. He'd disinherit her if she married him, said Mr. Ramsay. He did not look at the flowers which his wife was considering, but at a spot about a foot or so above them. There was no harm in him, he added, and was just about to say that anyhow. He was the only young man in England who admired his, when he choked it back. He would not bother her again about his books. These flowers seemed creditable, Mr. Ramsay said, lowering his gaze and noticing something red, something brown. But, yes, but then these she had put in with her own hands, said Mrs. Ramsay. The question was, what happened if she sent bulbs down? Did Kennedy plant them? It was his incurable laziness, she added, moving on. If she stood over him all day long with a spade in her hand, he did sometimes do a stroke of work. So they strolled along toward the red-hot pokers. Your tea teaching your daughters to exaggerate," said Mr. Ramsay, reproving her. "Her Aunt Camilla was far worse than she was," Mrs. Ramsay remarked. "Nobody ever held up your Aunt Camilla as a model of virtue that I'm aware of," said Mr. Ramsay. "She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw," said Mrs. Ramsay. "Somebody else was that," said Mr. Ramsay. "Prue was going to be far more beautiful than she was," said Mrs. Ramsay. "He saw no trace of it," said Mr. Ramsay. "Well then, look tonight," said Mrs. Ramsay. They paused. He wished Andrew could be induced to work harder. He would lose every chance of a scholarship if he didn't. "Oh, scholarships," she said. Mr. Ramsay thought her foolish for saying that about a serious thing like a scholarship. He should be very proud of Andrew if he got a scholarship, he said. She would be just as proud of him if he didn't, she answered. They disagreed always about this, but it did not matter. She liked him to believe in scholarships, and he liked her to be proud of Andrew, whatever he did. Suddenly she remembered those little paths on the edge of the cliffs. "Wasn't it late?" she asked. They hadn't come home yet. He flicked his watch carelessly open, but it was only just past 7. He held his watch open for a moment, deciding that he would tell her what he had felt on the terrace. To begin with, it was not reasonable to be so nervous. Andrew could look after himself. Then he wanted to tell her that when he was walking on the terrace just now, here he became uncomfortable, as if he were breaking into that solitude, that aloofness, that remoteness of hers. But she pressed him what he had wanted to tell her. She asked, thinking it was about going to the lighthouse, that he was sorry he had said, "Damn you," but no. He did not like to see her look so sad, he said. "Only whirl gathering," she protested, flushing a little. They both felt uncomfortable, as if they did not know whether to go on or go back. She had been reading fairy tales to James, she said. No, they could not share that. They could not say that. They had reached the gap between the 2 clumps of red-hot pokers, and there was the lighthouse again. But she would not let herself look at it. Had she known that he was looking at her, she thought, she would not have let herself sit there, thinking. She disliked anything that reminded her that she had been seen sitting, thinking. So she looked over her shoulder at the town. The lights were rippling and running as if they were drops of silver water held firm in a wind. And all the poverty, all the suffering had turned to that, Mrs. Ramsay thought. The lights of the town and of the harbor and of the boats seemed like a phantom net floating there to mark something which had sunk. Well, if he could not share her thoughts, Mr. Ramsay said to himself, he would be off then, on his own. He wanted to go on thinking, telling himself the story how Hume was stuck in a bog. He wanted to laugh. But first it was nonsense to be anxious about Andrew. When he was Andrew's age, he used to walk about the country all day long, with nothing but a biscuit in his pocket, and nobody bothered about him. Or thought that he had fallen over a cliff. He said aloud he thought he would be off for a day's walk if the weather held. He had had about enough of Banks and of Carmichael. He would like a little solitude. Yes, she said. It annoyed him that she did not protest. She knew that he would never do it. He was too old now to walk all day long with a biscuit in his pocket. She worried about the boys, but not about him. Years ago, before he had married, he thought, looking across the bay as they stood between the clumps of red-hot pokers. He had walked all day. He had made a meal off bread and cheese in a public house. He had worked 10 hours at a stretch. An old woman just popped her head in now and again and saw to the fire. That was the country he liked best, over there, those sandhills dwindling away into darkness. One could walk all day without meeting a soul. There was not a house, scarcely not a single village, for miles on end. One could worry things out alone. There were little sandy beaches where no one had been since the beginning of time. The seals sat up and looked at you. It sometimes seemed to him that in a little house out there alone, he broke off, sighing. He had no right. The father of 8 children, he reminded himself, and he would have been a beast and a cur to wish a single thing altered. Andrew would be a better man than he had been. Prue would be a beauty, her mother said. They would stem the flood a bit. That was a good bit of work on the whole, his 8 children. They showed he did not damn the poor little universe entirely, for on an evening like this, he thought, looking at the land dwindling away, the little island seemed pathetically small, half swallowed up in the sea. Poor little place, he murmured with a sigh. She heard him. He said the most melancholy things, but she noticed that directly he had said them, he always seemed more cheerful than usual. All this phrase-making was a game, she thought, for if she had said half what he said, she would have blown her brains out by now. It annoyed her, this phrase-making, and she said to him in a matter-of-fact way that it was a perfectly lovely evening. And what was he groaning about, she asked, half laughing, half complaining, for she guessed what he was thinking. He would have written better books if he had not married. He was not complaining, he said. She knew that he did not complain. She knew that he had nothing whatever to complain of. And he seized her hand and raised it to his lips and kissed it with an intensity that brought tears to her eyes. And quickly, he dropped it. They turned away from the view and began to walk up the path where the silver-green, spear-like plants grew, arm in arm. His arm was almost like a young man's arm, Mrs. Ramsay thought, thin and hard, and she thought with delight how strong he still was, though he was over 60, and how untamed and optimistic, and how strange it was that being convinced as he was of all sorts of horrors seemed not to depress him but to cheer him. Was it not odd, she reflected? Indeed, he seemed to her sometimes made differently from other people, born blind, deaf, and dumb to the ordinary things, but to the extraordinary things with an eye like an eagle's. His understanding often astonished her. But did he notice the flowers? No. Did he notice the view? No. Did he even notice his own daughter's beauty, or whether there was pudding on his plate or roast beef? He would sit at table with them like a person in a dream. And his habit of talking aloud or saying poetry aloud was growing on him, she was afraid, for sometimes it was awkward. Best and brightest, come away. Poor Miss Giddings, when he shouted that at her, almost jumped out of her skin. But then Mrs. Ramsay, though, instantly taking his side against all the silly Giddingses in the world, then, she thought, intimating by a little pressure on his arm that he walked up the hill too fast for her, and she must stop for a moment to see whether those were fresh molehills on the bank. Then, she thought, stooping down to look, a great mind like his must be different in every way from ours. All the great men she had ever known, she thought, deciding that a rabbit must have got in, were like that, and it was good for young men, though the atmosphere of lecture rooms was stuffy and depressing to her beyond endurance almost. Simply to hear him, simply to look at him. But without shooting rabbits, how was one to keep them down, she wondered. It might be a rabbit, it might be a mole. Some creature anyhow was ruining her evening primroses. And looking up, she saw above the thin trees the first pulse of the full throbbing star, and wanted to make her husband look at it, for the sight gave her such keen pleasure. But she stopped herself. He never looked at things. If he did, all he would say would be, "Poor little world," with one of his sighs. At that moment he said, very fine, to please her, and pretended to admire the flowers. But she knew quite well that he did not admire them or even realize that they were there. It was only to please her. Ah, but was that not Lily Briscoe strolling along with William Banks? She focused her short-sighted eyes upon the backs of a retreating couple. Yes, indeed it was. Did that not mean that they would marry? Yes, it must. What an admirable idea. They must marry. Chapter 13. He had been to Amsterdam, Mr. Banks was saying as he strolled across the lawn with Lily Briscoe. He had seen the Rembrandts. He had been to Madrid. Unfortunately, it was Good Friday and the Prado was shut. He had been to Rome. Had Miss Briscoe never been to Rome? Oh, she should. It would be a wonderful experience for her, the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo, and Padua with its Giottos. His wife had been in bad health for many years, so that their sightseeing had been on a modest scale. She had been to Brussels. She had been to Paris, but only for a flying visit to see an aunt who was ill. She had been to Dresden. There were masses of pictures she had not seen, however. Lily Briscoe reflected, perhaps it was better not to see pictures. They only made one hopelessly discontented with one's own work. Mr. Banks thought that one could carry that point of view too far. We can't all be Titans and we can't all be Darwins, he said. At the same time, he doubted whether you could have your Darwin and your Titian as if it weren't for the humble people like ourselves. Lily would have liked to pay him a compliment. You're not humble, Mr. Banks, she would have liked to have said, but he did not want compliments. Most men do, she thought. And she was a little ashamed of her impulse and said, nothing while he remarked that perhaps what he was saying did not apply to pictures. Anyhow, said Lily, tossing off her little insincerity, she would always go on painting because it interested her. Yes, said Mr. Banks, he was sure she would. And as they reached the end of the lawn, he was asking her whether she had difficulty in finding subjects in London when they turned and saw the Ramsays. So that is marriage, Lily thought. A man and a woman looking at a girl throwing a ball. That is what Mrs. Ramsay tried to tell me the other night, she thought, for she was wearing a green shawl and they were standing close together, watching Prue and Jasper throwing catches. And suddenly the meaning, which for no reason at all, as perhaps they are stepping out of the tube or ringing a doorbell, descends on people, making them symbolical, making them representative, came upon them and made them, in the dusk, standing, looking the symbols of marriage, husband and wife. Then, after an instant, a symbolical outline which transcended the real figures sank down again, and they became, as they met them, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, watching the children throwing catches. But still, for a moment, though, Mrs. Ramsay greeted them with her usual smile. Oh, she's thinking we're going to get married, Lily thought, and said, I have triumphed tonight, meaning that, for once, Mr. Banks had agreed to dine with them and not run off to his own lodging, where his man cooked vegetables properly. Still, for one moment there was a sense of things having been blown apart, of space, of irresponsibility as the ball soared high and they followed it and lost it, and saw the one star and the draped branches. In the failing light they all looked sharp-edged and ethereal and divided by great distances. Then, darting backwards over the vast space, for it seemed as if solidity had vanished altogether, Prue ran full tilt into them and caught the ball brilliantly high up in her left hand. And her mother said, Haven't they come back yet? Whereupon the spell was broken. Mr. Ramsay felt free now to laugh out loud and at the thought that Hume had stuck in a bog, and an old woman rescued him on condition he said the Lord's Prayer, and, chuckling to himself, he strolled off to his study. Mrs. Ramsay, bringing Prue back into throwing catches again, from which she had escaped, asked, Did Nancy go with them? Chapter 14. Certainly Nancy had gone with them, since Minta Doyle had asked it with her dumb look, holding out her hand, as Nancy made off after lunch to her attic, to escape the horror of family life. She supposed she must go then. She did not want to go. She did not want to be drawn into it at all. For as they walked along the road to the cliff, Minta kept on talking about her hand. Then she would let it go, then she would take it again. What was it she wanted? Nancy asked herself. There was something, of course, people wanted, for when Minta took her hand and held it, Nancy reluctantly saw the whole world spread out beneath her as if it were Constantinople seen through a mist. And then, however heavy-eyed one might be, one must needs ask, Is that Santa Sophia? Is that the Golden Horn? So Nancy asked when Minta took her hand, What is it that she wants? Is it that? And what was that? Here and there emerged from the mist as Nancy looked down upon life spread beneath her. A pinnacle, a dome, prominent things without names. But when Minta dropped her hand, as she did when they ran down the hillside. All that, the dome, the pinnacle, whatever it was that had protruded through the mist, sank down into it and disappeared. Minta, Andrew observed, was rather a good walker. She wore more sensible clothes than most women. She wore very short skirts and black knickerbockers. She would jump straight into a stream and flounder across. He liked her rashness, but he saw that it would not do. She would kill herself in some idiotic way one of these days. She seemed to be afraid of nothing except bulls. At the mere sight of a bull in a field, she would throw up her arms and fly screaming, which was the very thing to enrage a bull, of course. But she did not mind owning up to it in the least. One must admit that. She knew she was an awful coward about bulls, she said. She thought she must have been tossed in her perambulator when she was a baby. She didn't seem to mind what she said or did. Suddenly now, she pitched down on the edge of the cliff and began to sing some song about damn your eyes, damn your eyes. They all had to join in and sing the chorus and shout out together, damn your eyes, damn your eyes. But it would be fatal to let the tide come in and cover up all the good hunting grounds before they got on the beach. Fatal, Paul agreed, springing up. And as they went slithering down, he kept quoting the guidebook about these islands being justly celebrated for their park-like prospects and the extent and variety of their marine curiosities. But it would not do altogether, this shouting and damning your eyes, Andrew felt, picking his way down the cliff. This clapping him on the back and calling him old fellow and all that, it would not altogether do. It was the worst of taking women on walks. Once on the beach, they separated, he going out onto the Pope's Nose, taking his shoes off and rolling his socks in them and letting that couple look after themselves. Nancy waded out to her own rocks and searched her own pools and let that couple look after themselves. She crouched low down and touched the smooth, rubber-like sea anemones who were stuck like lumps of jelly to the side of the rock. Brooding, she changed the pool into the sea and made the minnows into sharks and whales, and cast vast clouds over this tiny world by holding her hand against the sun, and so brought darkness and desolation, like God himself, to millions of ignorant and innocent creatures. And then took her hand away suddenly and let the sun stream down. Out on the pale, crisscrossed sand, high-stepping, fringed, gauntleted, stalked some fantastic leviathan. She was still enlarging the pool, and slipped into the vast fissures of the mountainside. And then, letting her eyes slide imperceptibly above the pool and rest on that wavering line of sea and sky, on the tree trunks where the smoke of steamers made waver on the horizon, she became, with all that power seeping savagely in and inevitably withdrawing, hypnotized, and the two senses of that vastness and this tininess, the pool had diminished again. Flowering within it made her feel that she was bound hand and foot and unable to move by the intensity of feelings which reduced her own body, her own life, and the lives of all the people in the world forever to nothingness. So, listening to waves crouching over the pool, she brooded. And Andrew shouted that the sea was coming in, so she leapt, splashing through the shallow waves onto the shore, and ran up the beach and was carried by her own impetuosity and her desire for rapid movement right behind a rock, and there, oh heavens, in each other's arms were Paul and Minta, kissing probably. She was outraged, indignant. She and Andrew put on their shoes and stockings in dead silence without saying a thing about it. Indeed, they were rather sharp with each other. She might have called him when she saw the crayfish or whatever it was, Andrew grumbled. However, they both felt it's not our fault. They had not wanted this horrid nuisance to happen. All the same, it irritated Andrew that Nancy should be a woman, and Nancy that Andrew should be a man, and they tied their shoes very neatly and drew the bows rather tight. It was not until they had climbed right up onto the top of the cliff again that Minta cried out that she had lost her grandmother's brooch. Her grandmother's brooch, the sole ornament she possessed. A weeping willow it was, they must remember it, set in pearls. They must have seen it, she said, with the tears running down her cheeks. The brooch which her grandmother had fastened her cap with till the last day of her life. Now she had lost it. She would rather have lost anything than that. She would go back and look for it. They all went back. They poked and peered and looked. They kept their heads very low and said things shortly and gruffly. Paul Rayleigh searched like a madman all about the rock where they had been sitting. All this pother about a brooch really didn't do it all, Andrew thought, as Paul told him to make a thorough search between this point and that. The tide was coming in fast. The sea would cover the place where they had sat in a minute. There was not a ghost of a chance of finding it now. "We shall be cut off," Minta shrieked, suddenly terrified, as if there were any danger of that. It was the same as the bulls, all over again. She had no control over her emotions, Andrew thought. Women hadn't. The wretched Paul had to pacify her. The men, Andrew and Paul, at once became manly and different from usual, took counsel briefly and decided that they would plant Rayleigh's stick where they had sat and come back at low tide again. There was nothing more that could be done now. If the brooch was there, it would still be there in the morning, they assured her, but Minta still sobbed. All the way up to the top of the cliff, it was her grandmother's brooch. She would rather have lost anything but that, and yet Nancy felt it might be true that she minded losing her brooch, but she wasn't crying only for that. She was crying for something else. We might all sit down and cry, she felt, but she did not know what for. They drew a head together, Paul and Minta, and he comforted her and said how famous he was for finding things. Once, when he was a little boy, he had found a gold watch. He would get up at daybreak, and he was positive he would find it. It seemed to him that it would be almost dark, and he would be alone on the beach, and somehow it would be rather dangerous. He began telling her, though, that he would certainly find it, and she said that she would not hear of his getting up at dawn. It was lost. She knew that. She had a presentiment when she put it on that afternoon. And secretly he resolved that he would not tell her, but he would slip out of the house at dawn when they were all asleep. And if he could not find it, he would go to Edinburgh and buy her another, just like it, but more beautiful. He would prove what he could do. And as they came out on the hill and saw the lights of the town beneath them, the lights coming out suddenly one by one seemed like things that were going to happen to him. His marriage, his children, his house, and once again he thought as they came out onto the high road, which was shaded with high bushes. How they would retreat into solitude together and walk on and on, he always leading her, and she pressing close to his side as she did now. As they turned by the crossroads, he thought what an appalling experience he had been through, and he must tell someone, Mrs. Ramsay, of course, for it took his breath away to think what he had been and done. It had been, far and away, the worst moment of his life when he asked Minta to marry him. He would go straight to Mrs. Ramsay because he felt somehow that she was the person who had made him do it. She had made him think he could do anything. Nobody else took him seriously, but she made him believe that he could do whatever he wanted. He had felt her eyes on him all day today, following him about, though she never said a word, as if she were saying, yes, you can do it. I believe in you. I expect it of you. She had made him feel all that, and directly they got back, he looked for the lights of the house above the bay. He would go to her and say, I've done it, Mrs. Ramsay, thanks to you. And so, turning into the lane that led to the house, he could see lights moving about in the upper windows. They must be awfully late then. People were getting ready for dinner. The house was all lit up, and the lights, after the darkness, made his eyes feel full, and he said to himself, childishly, as he walked up the drive, lights, 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 and repeated in a dazed way, lights, 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 as they came into the house, staring about him with his face quite stiff. But, good heavens, he said to himself, putting his hand to his tie, I must not make a fool of myself. 15. Yes, said Prue in her considering way, answering her mother's question. I think Nancy did go with them. Chapter 16. Well then, Nancy had gone with them, Mrs. Ramsay supposed, wondering as she put down a brush, took up a comb and said, Come in, to a tap at the door. Jasper and Rose came in. Whether the fact that Nancy was with them made it less likely or more likely that anything would happen. It made it less likely. Somehow Mrs. Ramsay felt very irrational, except that, after all, Holocaust on such a scale was not probable. They could not all be drowned. And again, she felt alone in the presence of her old antagonist, life. Jasper and Rose said that Mildred wanted to know whether she should wait dinner. Not for the Queen of England, said Mrs. Ramsay emphatically. Not for the Empress of Mexico, she added, laughing at Jasper, for he shared his mother's vice. He, too, exaggerated. And if Rose liked, she said, while Jasper took the message, she might choose which jewels she was to wear. When there are 15 people sitting down to dinner, one cannot keep things waiting forever. She was now beginning to feel annoyed with them for being so late. It was inconsiderate of them, and it annoyed her, on top of her anxiety about them, that they should choose this very night to be out late when, in fact, she wished dinner to be particularly nice, since William Banks had, at last, consented to dine with them, and they were having Mildred's masterpiece, boeuf en daube. Everything depended upon things being served up to the precise moment they were ready. The beef, the bay leaf, and the wine all must be done to a turn. To keep it waiting was out of the question. Yet, of course, tonight, of all nights, out they went, and they came in late, and things had to be sent out. Things had to be kept hot. The buff en daube would be entirely spoiled. Jasper offered her an opal necklace, Rose a gold necklace. Which looked best against her black dress? Which did indeed, said Mrs. Ramsay, absent-mindedly, looking at her neck and shoulders, but avoiding her face in the glass. And then, while the children rummaged among her things, she looked out of the window at a sight which always amused her, the rooks trying to decide which tree to settle on. Every time they seemed to change their mind and rose up into the air again because she thought the old rook, the father rook, old Joseph was her name for him, was a bird of a very trying and difficult disposition. He was a disreputable old bird with half his wing feathers missing. He was like some seedy old gentleman in a top hat she had seen playing the horn in front of a public house. Look, she said, laughing. They were actually fighting. Joseph and Mary were fighting. Anyhow, they all went up again, and the air was shoved aside by their black wings and cut into exquisite scimitar shapes. The movements of the wings beating out, she could never describe it accurately enough to please herself. It was one of the loveliest of all to her. Look at that, she said to Rose, hoping that Rose would see it more clearly than she could. For one's children so often gave one's own perceptions a little thrust forwards. But which was it to be? They had all the trays of her jewel case open. The gold necklace, which was Italian, or the opal necklace, which Uncle James had brought her from India, or should she wear her amethysts? Choose, dearest, choose, she said, hoping that they would make haste. But she let them take their time to choose. She let Rose, particularly, take up this and then that, and hold her jewels against the black dress for this little ceremony of choosing jewels, which was gone through every night, was what Rose liked best, she knew. She had some hidden reason of her own for attaching great importance to this, choosing what her mother was to wear. What was the reason, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, standing still to let her clasp the necklace she had chosen, divining through her own past some deep, some buried, some quite speechless feeling that one had for one's mother at Rose's age. Like all feelings felt for oneself, Mrs. Ramsay thought it made one sad. It was so inadequate what one could give in return. And what Rose felt was quite out of proportion to anything she actually was. And Rose would grow up, and Rose would suffer, she supposed, with these deep feelings, and she said she was ready now, and they would go down, and Jasper, because he was the gentleman, should give her his arm, and Rose, as she was the lady, should carry her handkerchief. She gave her the handkerchief. And what else? Oh yes, it might be cold. A shawl. Choose me a shawl, she said, for that would please Rose, who was bound to suffer so. There, she said, stopping by the window on the landing. There they are again. Joseph had settled on another treetop. Don't you think they mind, she said to Jasper, having their wings broken? Why did he want to shoot poor old Joseph and Mary? He shuffled a little on the stairs and felt rebuked, but not seriously, for she did not understand the fun of shooting birds, and they did not feel. And being his mother, she lived away in another division of the world, but he rather liked her stories about Mary and Joseph. She made him laugh. But how did she know that those were Mary and Joseph? Did she think the same birds came to the same trees every night? He asked. But here, suddenly, like all grown-up people, she ceased to pay him the least attention. She was listening to a clatter in the hall. "They've come back," she exclaimed, and at once she felt much more annoyed with them than relieved. Then she wondered, had it happened, she would go down and they would tell her, but no, they could not tell her anything with all these people about. She must go down and begin dinner and wait. And like some queen who, finding her people gathered in the hall, looks down upon them and descends among them, and acknowledges their tributes silently, and accepts their devotion and their prostration before her. Paul did not move a muscle, but looked straight before him as she passed. She went down and crossed the hall and bowed her head very slightly, as if she accepted what they could not say, their tribute to her beauty. But she stopped. There was a smell of burning. Could they have let the bouffon d'aube overboil? She wondered, pray heaven not. When the great clangor of the gong announced solemnly, authoritatively, that all those scattered about in attics, in bedrooms, on little perches of their own, reading, writing, putting the last smooth to their hair, or fastening dresses, must leave all that, and the little odds and ends on their washing tables and dressing tables, and the novels on the bed tables, and the diaries which were so private, and assemble in the dining room for dinner. I hope you enjoyed that installment of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. There's a link to the full playlist of this book in the description of the video. If you'd like more of this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. Until next time, goodbye.